Records show 14% of the first 150 people arrested for crimes related to the Capitol riot were active military personnel or veterans. That includes current and former members of the Army, National Guard, Marines, and Air Force. The U.S. military says it is taking action to address extremism and white nationalism within their ranks. On Wednesday, a Pentagon spokesman said Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin ordered a 60-day stand down where the military will pause other activities to focus on the issue. For more on this, let's bring in Washington Post reporter Missy Ryan. She covers the Pentagon, military issues, and national security. Missy, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. So explain, first of all, what a stand down order is and what you know about what will take place during this time.
Yeah, well, as you said, Secretary Austin has identified extremism, confronting this threat as one of his main priorities. And what he's said that he's going to do is instruct all military units to conduct what they're calling a stand down, which is something that's really unusual. And it hasn't occurred in the 10 years that I've been writing about the military. And essentially, it makes it sound somewhat bigger than it is when you say a 60-day stand down. Essentially, it's asking all commanders to set aside a time. It could be a full day. It could be, several conversations over the course of some period of time for troops to halt their regular operations and then talk about extremism. Really, one of the problems that the military is facing at this moment is it doesn't have a great system to track incidents of domestic extremism, far-right support for far-right groups, including, the Proud Boys or QAnon or some white supremacist groups. It doesn't have a great understanding of how pervasive or how significant a threat this is in its own ranks. And I think that the stand down is one of the first steps that the Pentagon is taking in order to have a more sort of rigorous approach to this problem that's been around for many, many years, but it's always been seen as sort of this low-level fringe threat, but now it's suddenly thrust into the spotlight because of the events of January 6th.
So, Missy, has anything like this happened before, a kind of pause like this?
It hasn't happened, as I said, in the decade that I've been writing about the military, and it is very unusual. Obviously the military is aware that it has a big problem with sexual assault. In the last year, it's had this reckoning related to race generally, but this is something that is very, very unusual, and I think it's a sign of the fact that number one, of the sort of political pressure around this incident of January 6th and around this phenomenon. But also, it's a sign of the fact that the military is acknowledging that they don't have a great handle on this and that they're going to need the help of service members, not just to talk about the threats that they themselves face on a regular basis, but they're going to rely on troops to provide information about their peers in certain instances, and that's going to be a key tool in helping them identify the extent of the problem.
So do you expect to see, Missy, something more concrete in terms of policy from the Pentagon when it comes to these kinds of issues of extremism?
Yeah, I do. Actually, there had been a review that had been initiated even prior to January 6th as part of a review of race-related policy in the military. And so this review is supposed to conclude that the Pentagon is conducting of its treatment of far-right extremism is supposed to conclude in March. And then Secretary Austin has said that he's going to study that he's asking for additional recommendations, and he's going to basically make decisions about what needs to be done. I think that what you can expect to see are changes to to strengthen the way the Pentagon sort of tracks this issue, gathers data within the military, potential, regulatory changes for what is and is not permitted. It's been a little loose and inconsistent between the different military services, like, for example, differences between the Army and the Navy and the Marines. And so, there are some big questions that he'll have to confront, including, how much monitoring of troops' social media does he authorize? Are they going to change? How are they going to confront the First Amendment challenges associated with prohibiting certain kinds of speech or membership if it's not active or criminal membership in some organizations? So some of these are very, very thorny issues, but I think that they're showing renewed sort of resolve to confront these in a way that's different than what we've seen before.
So, during the transition, as you know, Missy, there was a lot of discussion about diversity within the president's cabinet picks, and that was certainly one of the considerations. But I'm curious, how did the newly installed Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's personal experience factor into his beliefs that extremism was, in fact, a pressing issue for the military?
Yeah, well, he did mention one incident. Obviously, he's the first African-American defense secretary and was the first African-American officer to occupy a number of positions as he rose up through the ranks. He eventually became the commander of Central Command, which is a very important job in the military. And he mentioned an incident during his confirmation hearing that he described as sort of a wake-up call for him in terms of the sometimes undetected threat from within the ranks. And that was a 1995 double murder that was conducted by members of the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And so, the way he described that was that basically it helped commanders recognize that they had not detected some signs that were out there and detect this band of underground Nazis within the Army at that time. That included people making comments, people having Nazi flags in their barracks rooms, things like that. And so he mentioned that as something that really shaped his approach to this issue. And I think that one of what we will expect to see in terms of a reflection of that experience is just an attempt to put the onus on commanders to know the troops that are under their command, to be on the lookout for specific red flags, and to act on them when they're observed.
I want to switch gears finally here, Missy, because you and your colleagues at the Washington Post are just out with a piece that's titled U.S. Ending Support for Saudi-Led War in Yemen as Biden Shifts Foreign Policy Priorities. Tell us about the significance of this move. This was an announcement we talked about earlier in the show, one of many on the foreign policy front, as clearly President Biden is seeking to carve out a very different approach to foreign policy than his predecessor.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, this was one of the central pieces of this first big foreign policy address that President Biden gave at the State Department today. And what he's saying is that they're going to end American support for the war, end American support for offensive operations in Yemen. And basically what that means is that they're signaling it's a warning, essentially, to the Saudi-led coalition that has been battling the Houthi rebels there, and for many, many years has been associated with civilian casualties in high numbers in what U.S. officials have described as an unacceptable recurrence of civilian casualties. And so, the nitty-gritty details really haven't been announced yet, and it's hard to gauge the significance of the practical change. One of the things that they've said they're going to do is cut off arms sales that can be used in offensive operations. That in itself is significant. There was a big proposed deal, a proposed sale of precision munitions that was announced at the end of the Trump administration. I think we can see that totally scrapped. But in terms of the remaining military support, it is not actually very significant right now. We stopped doing aerial refueling in 2018. We do some intelligence sharing with the Saudi-led coalition, but that's mostly defensive in nature. So I think the significance may be more symbolic and political in terms of signaling a renewed interest in the conflict in Yemen, a willingness to invest political capital in trying to solve the war, and telegraphing to the Saudi-led coalition that the U.S. is not going to stand by much longer.
All right, Missy Ryan of the Washington Post. Missy, great to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.